Clint Eastwood walked into the courthouse, his presence commanding instant respect. Across the room, Officer Travis Holt smirked. He thought he had already won. Cameras flashed, the world watching, but Clint wasn't here for the spectacle. He was here for justice. What happened next would shake the entire system, expose corruption at its core, and prove that even in his 90s, Clint Eastwood was still the man to fear. Stay till the end, because this story will leave you speechless. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The courtroom buzzed softly as people whispered among themselves, their voices blending into a low hum. Then the heavy wooden doors swung open. Clint Eastwood stepped inside. The room seemed to react instinctively. Conversations died down. Jurors shifted. The bailiff straightened his posture. Even the judge, a man who had seen countless trials, paused for a brief moment before returning his focus to the case files in front of him. Clint walked with measured steps, his dark blazer crisp against the stark white of his button-down shirt. His silver white hair was neatly combed back, revealing sharp, weathered features that had faced down far worse than this courtroom. Across the room, Officer Travis Holt barely glanced up. Leaning back in his chair, he stretched his arms behind his head, the picture of unshaken arrogance. His uniform was crisp, his badge polished to perfection. But Clint knew what lay beneath the surface. Holt turned to his lawyer, grinning. He whispered something under his breath and his lawyer chuckled. To them, this was already won. The case? A simple abuse of power. Holt had falsely arrested a young man, Michael Carter, on fabricated charges, planted evidence, a bogus police report, the kind of thing that happened all the time but never made it to trial. Michael sat near the front, his hands balled into fists on his lap. His suit was slightly wrinkled, his expression a mix of anger and unease. He had seen what the system did to people like him. He knew Holt wasn't worried. Clint, however, wasn't here to play by Holt's rules. He approached the witness stand, slow and steady. No rush, no wasted movements. The tension in the air thickened as he took his seat. For the first time, Holt's gaze lifted. Their eyes met. Clint didn't blink. The judge, an older man with deep-set eyes, adjusted his glasses and tapped his gavel. Order in the court. Let's proceed. Holt smirked. And then he laughed. A small chuckle, barely loud enough to be heard, but in the silence, it was deafening. Michael stiffened. The gallery shifted uncomfortably. Even a few jurors exchanged uneasy glances. Clint? Clint didn't move. Holt shook his head, muttering, "This is ridiculous. We all know how this ends." His lawyer didn't stop him. The judge barely reacted. Clint exhaled slowly. He had come here to present the truth, to let the facts speak for themselves. But that laugh, that changed everything. His ice blue eyes darkened, his gaze turning razor sharp. And then he narrowed his eyes. If Holt thought Clint was just another old man testifying in court, he was dead wrong. Now it was personal. Officer Travis Holt sat with his legs stretched out, his arms draped over the back of his chair, completely at ease. To him, this wasn't a trial. It was a formality, a game he had played before, and always won. His defense attorney smirked, flipping through a file without urgency. The confidence in his posture made one thing clear. He didn't see Clint Eastwood as a threat. The judge barely looked interested, rubbing his temple like he had seen this case 100 times before. Maybe he had, but Clint noticed everything. He had been in enough battles to recognize when the deck was stacked. The way Holt's lawyer sat comfortably, like he already knew the verdict. The way the judge sighed every time the prosecution spoke, like he had somewhere better to be. And most of all, the way Holt acted like he had already won. Michael Carter sat quietly at the plaintiff's table, his shoulders tense. His fists remained clenched on his lap. His eyes burned with anger, but beneath it, there was something else. Fear, because he knew what Clint knew. Men like Holt didn't lose. Not in places like this. Clint adjusted his posture, calm but focused. He knew how these things worked. He wasn't here to argue. He was here to expose. The prosecutor cleared his throat. "Mr. Eastwood, please state your name for the record." Clint leaned slightly toward the microphone. Clint Eastwood. His voice was low, steady, no rush, no nerves. Just as he opened his mouth to continue, a loud yawn cut through the room. Holt. He stretched his arms, shaking his head dramatically, then muttered, "For God's sake, do we really have to listen to this?" A few soft chuckles came from the back of the courtroom. The judge tapped his gavel, barely putting effort into it. "Order in the court," he said, voice flat, uninterested. Holt leaned toward his lawyer, whispering something with a grin. His lawyer smirked but said nothing. Clint watched the exchange, his expression unreadable. He had walked into plenty of rooms like this before. He exhaled slowly, then leaned forward ever so slightly. His blue eyes locked onto Holt. "Son," Clint said, voice low but firm. The room quieted. "You really don't know who you're dealing with, do you?" Holt's smirk twitched. For the first time, he hesitated. The courtroom was silent as Clint Eastwood settled in his seat. Officer Travis Holt leaned back, arms crossed, still smirking. But it wasn't the same smug confidence from before. There was something else beneath it now. Uncertainty. Clint had seen it before. Men like Holt always believed they were untouchable. They relied on fear, corruption, and the system protecting them. But today, the truth was bigger than the system. Clint took a breath and began, his voice steady and deliberate. "I was there that night," he said, looking directly at the jury, standing just a few feet away when Officer Holt pulled over Michael Carter. A few jurors leaned forward. Even the judge, who had been indifferent up until now, finally lifted his gaze. Michael wasn't speeding, wasn't swerving, wasn't breaking any laws, Clint continued. He was just there. Wrong place, wrong time. Holt scoffed, shaking his head. "This is ridiculous." Clint's icy blue eyes locked onto him. "That's exactly what you told him, wasn't it?" he said, his voice sharp. "Give me a break, kid. Just say you had the drugs and maybe you get to walk." The tension in the room tightened. Michael clenched his fists. His mother, sitting quietly in the back, wiped at her eyes. "I watched Officer Holt drag him out of the car," Clint continued, "throw him against the hood, patted him down, searched his pockets, and when he found nothing, he made sure there was something to find." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Holt's lawyer stood, adjusting his tie, trying to regain control. "Your Honor, this is nothing more than theatrics," he said, his tone full of false amusement. "Mr. Eastwood might be a legendary storyteller, but this is a court of law, not a movie set." Some people chuckled. Holt's smirk returned, but Clint didn't react. He let the moment breathe, let the laughter settle, let Holt and his lawyer enjoy one last second of false confidence. Then, without a word, Clint reached into his jacket. Slow, deliberate, no rush. His hand emerged holding a small, silver USB drive. Holt's smirk vanished. Clint placed the USB drive on the table in front of him. "Your Honor," he said, his voice calm but firm, "this contains footage from a nearby security camera. And if Officer Holt wants to talk about theatrics..." Clint's gaze flicked toward him, his face unreadable. "He's about to see the performance of his life." The courtroom erupted. The air in the courtroom was thick with tension. All eyes were on the small silver USB drive resting on the polished wooden table. It looked unassuming, but everyone in the room could sense this was the moment that changed everything. Clint Eastwood sat motionless, his fingers still resting on the drive. He didn't speak, didn't move. He just let the weight of what was about to happen settle over the room. The judge adjusted his glasses, now looking more interested than he had at any point during the trial. He exhaled, then gestured toward the bailiff. "Let's see it." The bailiff retrieved the USB, walking it over to the prosecution's desk. The courtroom was so quiet, the sound of the metal plug clicking into the court's monitor felt deafening. The screen flickered to life. For a split second, there was nothing but static. Then the footage began. A grainy black and white security feed from a nearby store showed the night in question. Michael Carter's car, flashing blue and red lights. Officer Holt stepping out. The video was silent, but the scene played out with brutal clarity. Holt could be seen approaching the driver's side, his body language aggressive. He yanked the door open and ripped Michael from his seat, shoving him against the hood. The young man's hands were raised in pure confusion. Then, the moment that froze the entire courtroom, Holt reached into his own pocket, pulled something out, and carefully placed it inside the car. The timestamp in the corner of the footage confirmed it all. It was planted. A single gasp rang out from the gallery. Then another. A wave of murmurs followed. The judge sat up straighter, his expression shifting for the first time. Michael Carter, who had remained rigid and silent throughout the trial, slowly turned toward Holt. His eyes burned with anger and disbelief. Holt's face drained of color. The smirk, gone. The arrogance, evaporated. Even his own lawyer's expression twisted into something unreadable. The prosecutor leaned forward, tapping his pen against his notepad. "Your Honor, I believe this is more than enough evidence to..." "Objection!" Holt's lawyer shot up from his seat. Too fast, too panicked. The judge frowned. "On what grounds?" The lawyer hesitated. He was scrambling, grasping for something. Anything. This footage, he started, clearing his throat. We have no way of proving its authenticity. It could have been edited. A low grumble of protest rolled through the crowd. Clint smirked. That's funny, he said, finally breaking his silence. Because just a minute ago, you were calling my testimony theatrics. The room shifted. The jury was no longer indifferent. Some of them were leaning forward, others shaking their heads. The judge pressed his lips together, looking down at the monitor again. This is damning evidence, he muttered under his breath. Holt swallowed hard. His hands curled into fists, his breathing shallow. He could feel it slipping. His control, his power, his career. But then, he did something strange. Instead of snapping or arguing, Holt leaned over. He whispered something to his lawyer. Something quiet. Something calculated. The lawyer's jaw tightened. He gave the smallest nod. Clint caught every movement. His expression darkened. Holt wasn't done yet. He had one last trick up his sleeve. The courtroom held its breath. All eyes were locked on the grainy security footage still frozen on the screen. The proof that Officer Travis Holt had planted evidence. The truth had been laid out in black and white. There was no way out, or so it seemed. The judge, a man who had shown little emotion throughout the trial, let out a deep sigh. He rubbed his forehead, glanced at the monitor, then looked over at the defense table. This evidence is damning, he admitted, his voice heavy. Then after a pause, he added, but we need to authenticate it. The mood shifted instantly. Holt's lawyer shot up from his seat, grabbing onto that moment like a lifeline. Your Honor, that's exactly our point, he said, his voice louder than before. There's no verifiable proof that this footage is legitimate. In an age of AI and deepfake technology, this could have been manipulated. A low groan rippled through the crowd. Someone muttered, "Are you kidding me?" But the judge didn't react. Michael Carter, who had been sitting rigidly in his chair, suddenly slumped back, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned white. Holt, who had been pale only moments ago, exhaled slowly, his confidence returning like a snake slithering back into its den. His smirk crept back as he leaned toward his lawyer and whispered something. Clint saw the exchange. He recognized the look in Holt's eyes. He thinks he just got away with it. The judge tapped his gavel lightly. Without authentication, this video cannot be admitted as primary evidence. A murmur spread through the gallery. Disbelief, frustration, a sense of injustice creeping in again. Michael lowered his head. Hope was slipping through his fingers. Holt stretched his arms, settling comfortably in his seat, before turning to Clint with a look that practically screamed, "Nice try, old man." But Clint didn't blink. He sat still, his expression unreadable. Then without urgency, he reached down, adjusted his jacket and stood. The room fell silent again. He let the moment breathe, let the tension build. Then he finally spoke. That was just the first tape. Every head in the courtroom snapped toward him. Holt's smirk vanished. The judge raised an eyebrow. Even Holt's lawyer, who had looked so sure of himself seconds ago, tensed. Michael lifted his gaze, his hands still clenched. But now, there was something else in his eyes. Hope. For the first time since the trial began, Holt looked truly afraid. The courtroom wasn't silent anymore. The moment Clint Eastwood had spoken, that was just the first tape, the atmosphere shifted. No longer was this just another legal proceeding. No longer was this a game where Officer Travis Holt could smirk his way through. The judge looked at Clint with newfound interest. His initial indifference had faded, replaced by something far sharper. Curiosity. Mr. Eastwood, the judge said, adjusting his glasses, are you saying there's additional evidence? Clint didn't answer immediately. Instead, he turned slightly, tilting his head toward the courtroom doors. See for yourself, he said, his voice steady. The heavy wooden doors creaked open. A man entered, walking with calm confidence, a sleek black laptop tucked under his arm. He wasn't a cop. He wasn't a lawyer. He was something worse for Holt. He was a private investigator. A ripple of whispers spread through the crowd. The tension tripled. Holt shifted in his seat. His smirk twitched. His hands clenched into fists. The man strode toward the prosecution's table, placed the laptop down, and plugged it into the courtroom's large display monitor. This, Clint said, stepping forward, is a live feed of Holt's previous cases being reviewed. A low gasp spread across the courtroom. Holt's lawyer shot up, panic flashing in his eyes. Objection. This is... Sit down, the judge interrupted, his patience gone. The screen flickered to life. For a moment, it was just a loading symbol. Then the live feed began. A government office appeared on the screen. Seated inside was a serious-looking official, staring at a row of body cam videos playing side by side. Each one showed Travis Holt, clip after clip after clip. In the first, Holt was pulling over a young black man, immediately slamming him onto the hood before even asking for ID. In another, Holt was seen forcing a confession out of a teenager, his voice laced with pure intimidation. And then came the worst one. A handcuffed man sat in the back of Holt's cruiser, clearly terrified. Holt turned, pulled the camera closer to his own face, and grinned. "They'll believe whatever I say," Holt sneered in the footage. That's the beauty of it. The entire courtroom erupted. Shouts, gasps, murmurs. Reporters scribbled furiously. Even the bailiffs exchanged wide-eyed glances. Michael Carter sat frozen, staring at the screen in disbelief, his entire body tensed. Holt? Holt was sweating. His hands gripped the table. His once cocky posture collapsed inward. The judge leaned forward. His face, previously unreadable, was now etched with something new: rage. "Mr. Holt," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "do you have an explanation for this?" Holt didn't answer. His lawyer, normally quick-witted and dismissive, was now whispering to him frantically. But Holt wasn't listening. He was watching his career burn in real time. Clint took a slow step forward, his presence looming. "So," he said, his voice calm, steady, merciless, "if you want to talk about authentic evidence, let's talk." Holt's breathing hitched. His eyes darted wildly across the room, searching for something, anything. And then he snapped. With no warning, Holt lunged out of his chair. Chaos erupted. Court officers moved fast. Holt's lawyer shouted his name, trying to stop him, but it was too late. Holt was desperate, cornered, and desperate men always made mistakes. Holt had lost control. But what was he about to do next? The air in the courtroom had thickened like a storm about to break. Moments ago, Officer Travis Holt had been arrogant, smirking, acting as if the entire trial was just another inconvenience. But now he looked like a man on the verge of collapse. His face had lost color, sweat beaded at his brow, and his jaw was clenched so tightly it looked like it might crack. The evidence, the undeniable footage of his corruption, played over and over in the minds of everyone in the room. The courtroom, which had been filled with murmurs and whispers just moments before, now sat in stunned silence. Then Holt broke. "This is a setup!" His voice boomed through the courtroom. Every head turned sharply in his direction. His lawyer reached for his arm, whispering urgently, "Travis, keep it together." Holt ripped his arm away so violently that his chair toppled over with a loud crash. The sound echoed through the room, making several jurors flinch. "This is complete bulls! He shouted, his voice laced with panic. Michael Carter, the young man Holt had falsely arrested, sat frozen at the prosecution's table. His knuckles turned white as he clenched his fists beneath the table, but he didn't speak. He just stared at Holt, his breathing shallow, watching as the man who once held all the power crumbled before him. The judge, who had been watching with narrowed eyes, finally moved. He lifted his gavel, tapping it firmly against the bench. "Mr. Holt, I am warning you. Sit down and control yourself." Holt wasn't listening. His eyes darted wildly around the room, like a trapped animal searching for an exit. His rage turned toward Clint. "This old man, he's been after me from the start." Holt jabbed a shaking finger at Clint Eastwood, his voice cracking under the weight of his fury. "You think this is justice? This is a damn witch hunt." His lawyer leaned in again, desperation on his face. "Travis, stop talking, right now." But Holt wasn't thinking anymore. He was reacting. The courtroom was so quiet that you could hear the sound of Holt's ragged breathing. Then Clint spoke. His voice was low, steady, absolute. "This is the part," he said calmly, his eyes never leaving Holt, "where the bad guy makes his last mistake." Holt's face twisted in fury. And then he snapped. With no warning, Holt lunged forward, but not toward Clint, toward the courtroom doors. In a split second, his body tensed. His feet pounded against the polished wooden floor as he raced toward the exit, shoving past anything in his way. A bailiff reached out, trying to grab him, but Holt was still fast, desperate, wild. He threw his elbow back, knocking the man off balance. He could see the doors. Just a few feet more. He could still escape. His pulse pounded in his ears. "Move! Move!" he shouted as he crashed into the heavy wooden doors, throwing his full weight against them. The doors burst open. For a single heartbeat, Holt believed he was free. Then, he stopped dead in his tracks. A wall of officers stood waiting on the other side. Holt had nowhere left to run. Travis Holt had spent years walking free, bending the law to his advantage. But in this moment, as he slammed through the courtroom doors, he ran straight into his worst nightmare: justice. The instant he stepped through, he froze. A wall of officers stood waiting. Their expressions were blank, their stances firm. There was no escape. Holt's chest rose and fell rapidly. His mind, which had always been sharp enough to manipulate the system, now couldn't find a way out. The officer in front, a broad-shouldered man with graying hair and a stone-cold stare, stepped forward. He gripped a pair of shining silver handcuffs, holding them up just enough for Holt to see. "Officer Holt," the man said, voice flat and unwavering, "you are under arrest." Holt took a small step back, his entire body tense. "No," he muttered, shaking his head. His hands twitched at his sides. A younger officer moved in, his voice cold as steel. "You have the right to remain silent," he began. The courtroom behind them had gone dead silent. Even the reporters, who had spent the trial scribbling notes and whispering among themselves, now sat frozen, eyes wide, cameras rolling. The judge adjusted his glasses, his face unreadable, before turning to the prosecutor. "Effective immediately," the judge announced, his tone now firm and commanding. "I want a full investigation into this department. This corruption does not end with just one officer." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Reporters scratched hurried notes. Jurors exchanged looks. The weight of what was happening began to sink in. Michael Carter, the young man Holt had framed, let out a slow, shaky breath. Then, for the first time in weeks, he smiled. Clint Eastwood, still standing near the witness stand, watched it all unfold. He didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply adjusted his hat, his movements slow and deliberate. Then finally he spoke. "Told you," Clint said, his voice calm but firm. Holt's face contorted with fury. His breathing was ragged, his shoulders heaving. The handcuffs clicked around his wrists. The moment he had feared most had arrived. But Clint isn't done yet. He still has one more thing to do. The air outside the courthouse was thick with anticipation. A sea of reporters stood behind metal barricades, their cameras flashing, microphones raised like weapons, each one eager to be the first to get a statement. The entire country had watched the trial unfold, had seen the downfall of Officer Travis Holt in real time. But there was a feeling in the air that this wasn't over. The question on everyone's mind wasn't about what had happened today. It was about what was coming next. Then the heavy wooden doors of the courthouse swung open. Clint Eastwood stepped out, walking with slow, measured steps down the grand staircase. He didn't rush. He didn't hesitate. His face, lined with years of experience and wisdom, remained unreadable. The flashing cameras reflected off his crisp black suit, but he didn't flinch. He had been in the public eye for decades, had faced scrutiny more times than he could count. But this moment, this one, felt different. The second he appeared, the reporters swarmed forward like a wave crashing against a cliff. "Mr. Eastwood, what do you have to say about today's verdict? Did you expect Officer Holt to react the way he did? Do you think the police department will actually change after this?" The voices blended into a chaotic roar. Microphones pushed toward his face, cameras zooming in on every flicker of movement. But Clint, he just kept walking. His boots hit the pavement in a steady rhythm, the only sound he seemed to acknowledge. He moved through the crowd like a ghost, unaffected by the noise, by the energy of the moment. The questions grew more aggressive, each reporter desperate for a headline. "Was this personal for you?" one asked. "Do you think this is the start of a bigger movement?" Another shouted. Still, Clint remained silent. He was letting them stew, letting the weight of his silence settle. Then, one voice cut through the rest. "Mr. Eastwood, what's next?" Unlike the others, this reporter didn't shout. She didn't shove forward. She just stood there, waiting, her notepad held loosely in one hand. It was the kind of question that didn't need theatrics, and Clint knew it. Finally, he stopped. The entire crowd hushed. Even the reporters who had been barking questions moments before fell silent, turning to see what Clint would say. He slowly turned toward the young journalist, his sharp blue eyes locking onto hers. There was something in his gaze, something calculated, something knowing. Without breaking eye contact, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The crowd tensed. A moment passed as he looked at the screen. Then, with his signature, slow drawl, he spoke. "We're doing it." The words were simple, but they landed like a thunderclap. A ripple of confusion spread through the reporters. Some exchanged glances. Others scribbled furiously in their notepads. The young journalist's eyebrows lifted slightly, but her voice remained steady. "Doing what?" she asked. Clint didn't answer right away. He slipped his phone back into his jacket pocket, adjusting the fabric as if nothing had happened. Then, just for a fraction of a second, he smirked. Not a grin, not a full smile, just the faintest curve of his lips, a hint of something bigger brewing beneath the surface. And without another word, he turned and walked away. The reporters stood frozen for half a second before the dam broke. "Clint, wait! What are you planning? Is this about the police department? A new case? What do you mean by we? Who else is involved?" The noise erupted again, louder than before, cameras flashing, questions firing from every direction. But Clint didn't stop. He didn't turn around. He moved through the chaos with the same unshakable presence he had in the courtroom. By the time he reached his car, the questions had turned into speculation, and by the next morning, headlines exploded across every major news outlet. Clint Eastwood had just announced something huge. The world woke up to headlines that no one saw coming. Clint Eastwood takes on law enforcement reform. Hollywood legend launches initiative to hold police accountable. Eastwood versus the system. What this means for the future of policing? The media firestorm was immediate. News anchors dissected the announcement. Social media exploded. Everyone wanted to know, what exactly was Clint Eastwood planning? By midday, the press conference was set. The podium stood on the courthouse steps, cameras lining the streets, journalists packed tightly, waiting. The crowd buzzed with speculation. Some called him a hero, others called him reckless. But everyone was listening. Then Clint Eastwood stepped forward, dressed in a simple dark suit, no Hollywood glamour, no unnecessary flair, just a man who meant business. His expression was unreadable, but his presence commanded absolute attention. The murmurs died instantly as he adjusted the microphone, his sharp blue eyes scanning the crowd. "I'm not a politician," he began, his voice steady, calm. "I'm not here to sell you promises, but I've seen enough in my lifetime to know one thing. Justice isn't about power, it's about truth. And right now we've got a system that's forgotten that." Cameras flashed. Reporters scribbled furiously. "That changes today." Gasps rippled through the crowd. The weight of his words settled like a stone. Clint leaned forward slightly. "I've spent my life telling stories about lawmen, about justice. But stories aren't enough. Real justice? That takes action. That's why I'm backing a full-scale initiative to hold law enforcement accountable. We're talking real training, real reform, and real consequences for those who abuse the badge." The reporters barely kept up. "Mr. Eastwood, what will this initiative include?" one shouted. Clint didn't miss a beat. "Independent oversight committees, body cam reviews, public accountability measures. Officers who break the law don't get protected. They get prosecuted. That's the way it should have been from the start." The crowd erupted. Some cheered, some jeered. The tension was thick. And then, the biggest shock of all, "We'll also have people who know what it means to be on the other side of injustice." He turned to the man standing beside him, Michael Carter, the young man Holt had tried to frame, the same man who had once lost all faith in the system. Now, he was stepping up. "Michael here is going to be working with us. He's lived it. He knows what real reform looks like." Michael, dressed in a fitted blazer, stepped up to the mic. His voice didn't shake. He wasn't afraid anymore. "For too long, guys like Holt got to walk away while people like me lost everything. Not anymore." The audience hung on every word. And as for Holt, his badge was gone. His future? A prison sentence. And the man leading the charge? Clint himself. The world had seen Clint Eastwood take down corrupt cops in the movies, but this time, it was real. The footage of Travis Holt's arrest had spread like wildfire. The once smug officer, now in cuffs, being dragged out of the courthouse. It was the image that shattered trust in a broken system. Within hours, major networks dissected every moment of the case. Legal analysts weighed in, and activists called it a turning point in law enforcement accountability. But Clint knew better. One victory wasn't enough. The real fight had just begun. By sunrise, news outlets had already shifted their focus, not just on Holt, but on the police department as a whole. Investigations were opening. Officers were being placed on administrative leave. Cases tied to Holt's name were being re-examined. It turned out Holt wasn't the only problem. He was just the tip of the iceberg. Clint sat in his office watching the morning news. The anchor's voice was calm, but the story was anything but. Sources confirmed that several high-ranking officials within the department have been implicated in a widening corruption scandal. The DA's office is reportedly reviewing past convictions linked to Officer Holt and his colleagues, raising concerns about systemic abuse of power. Clint exhaled, rubbing his fingers together in thought. "You really set off a storm, huh? Michael Carter leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, watching the screen. His posture was relaxed, but there was a fire behind his eyes, a fire that hadn't been there weeks ago. Storm needed to happen, Clint replied, turning toward him. People only pay attention when something shakes the ground beneath them. Michael nodded, stepping inside. For the first time in weeks, he wasn't a victim. He was a voice. I've got my first sit-down interview today, Michael said. National coverage. They want me to talk about everything. Holt, the arrest, and what comes next. Clint studied him for a moment. You ready for that? Michael exhaled. I wasn't, but I am now. Clint gave a slight nod. Then go tell them the truth. A few hours later, the country watched as Michael Carter sat across from one of the most respected journalists in television. Michael, just weeks ago, you were facing years in prison for a crime you didn't commit. Now you're one of the faces of police reform. How does it feel? Michael took a deep breath before speaking. It shouldn't have taken someone like Clint Eastwood stepping in for me to get justice, he said, his voice steady. That's the problem. People like Holt, guys who abuse their power, they count on silence. They count on people being too afraid to fight back. But Clint, he fought back. And because of that, the world is watching. The journalist leaned forward. And now you're working with him directly. What's next for you? Michael straightened in his seat, making sure no one else has to go through what I did. The interview was a wake-up call to the nation. Michael's words weren't just about himself. They were about every person who had been wrongfully arrested, every case that had been buried, every voice that had gone unheard. And Clint? He wasn't done. Back at Clint's office, his desk was covered in the stacks of documents, case files, reports, messages from civil rights attorneys and activists. The phone hadn't stopped ringing since the press conference. His team had been flooded with requests from city officials, from law firms, from organizations wanting to join forces. You've done more in a week than most politicians do in a lifetime, Jack, his longtime assistant, said, shaking his head as he walked in. Clint smirked, adjusting his jacket. Yeah? Well, I'm not a politician, Jack scoffed. Could have fooled me. Clint glanced at the headlines still rolling across the television screen. The pressure was mounting, the spotlight brighter than ever. He had flipped the system on its head, but systems don't change overnight. And what happens when this mess is done? Jack asked. Clint didn't hesitate. There's always another fight, because as long as injustice exists, Clint Eastwood will always be ready.